Okay, hello everyone. This is Nayaswami Asha, which you may have suspected. And we are doing Swami's 26 Keys to Higher Awareness, and we are up to number 18. And it is about enthusiasm. And I'm going to read it to you. It says, act enthusiastic and you'll be enthusiastic. This is actually a quote from Dale Carnegie. Dale Carnegie was very well known during Master's lifetime. He perhaps is less well known now in the fickle way of popularity. But Dale Carnegie is a man well worth knowing. He wrote the book, How to Win Friends and Influence People, which is an interesting title, but it's actually quite a seriously good book. I don't know, I'm sure you can get it through Amazon or other places now. It's really worth getting. He really understood a lot of very high principles. At the time that Master came to America in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, there were a number of people who were picking up sort of like the new ideas that Master had articulated in their most complete form, but the idea being you can influence your circumstances by your own consciousness. And Dale Carnegie's book with that title actually is a really insightful treatise about how to win friends. And by influence, what did he say, win friends and influence people? By influence, he actually means inspire. So the title sounds self-serving, but it isn't really. It's really how you can bring the best out of yourself and others. So one of Dale Carnegie's aphorisms was, act enthusiastic and you will be enthusiastic. So Swami quotes him here. It was Dale Carnegie who gave this famous saying to the world. In books and in lectures across the country, he would urge people not to wait for circumstances to transform their indifference into enthusiasm. Even if you feel uninspired, he told his audiences, act as though you are overflowing with enthusiasm. He cited convincing examples of people who had been failures in life, but who in a very short time had become outstanding successes by following this principle. When you act out an attitude, the action itself is a kind of affirmation. So we have many different threads we can pick this up from the level of affirmation, from the level of magnetism, from converting failure energy to success energy. And here's another interesting angle that I would like to start with, and then we'll go in many directions from here. In Swami Kriyananda's Affirmations and Healing Prayers, I always look back here, but I don't see a copy of the book immediately. Affirmations for Self-Healing, that wonderful book that we read from every week in our Sunday services. He has an entry on enthusiasm. So I thought I would look it up, and the first sentence of it is the one that really is the most interesting to me in this moment. Enthusiasm is the spirit of joy channeled through the power of the will. Enthusiasm is the spirit of joy channeled through the power of the will. And then he says, if you want to know joy, we must live always in the full expectation of it. And then to achieve joy, divine joy, one must be keenly enthusiastic in everything one does. Now, it's a little, it might seem on the surface of it a little contradictory, but that was fascinating to me, and I'm going to give you the other piece of it about why that particular line, enthusiasm is the spirit of joy channeled through the power of the will. About a month before he died, April 21st, 2013, it was Easter, and Swami Kriyananda wrote a letter that went out to the world. All the people who regularly would communicate with Ananda received this letter from Swamiji. Now, of course, in retrospect, I don't think he lived a month after he wrote that letter. But one of the things he mentioned in the letter was, I no longer feel any enthusiasm for anything. And he said, enthusiasm has always been the hallmark of my character. I'm not quite sure I've quoted him exactly, but that was certainly the sense of it. Many people found that terribly alarming, and in fact, it turned out to be an announcement that he was about to leave his body and go on to divine freedom, in fact. Swami was surprised that people took it so hard, so to speak. They thought it was such a depressing thing for him to say. And I understood it in a slightly different way, but I actually understand it perfectly now when I read this single sentence. Swamiji wasn't actually saying, which is what people heard, that he wasn't feeling inner joy. He just no longer felt to use his willpower to bring that inner joy out into any kind of outward expression. And that had always been the hallmark of his character. He describes when he first read Autobiography of a Yogi in 1948. The book had been published for 2 years. It was published in 1946. And in 1948, he was in New York City and he read Autobiography of a Yogi. He was so utterly captivated by Master's consciousness that it took him 3 days and 3 nights to read the book, basically. And then almost immediately, within 1 day, he got on a Greyhound bus. He left everything in New York behind. And he traveled across the country to Los Angeles and went directly as he could to where Paramhansa Yogananda was living. He introduced himself to Master and then said, "I want to be your disciple." And that was pretty much that. All the years later, when he was 86 years old, and all his life from the age of 22, he'd been an absolutely devoted disciple, especially devoted to serving his guru. And Swamiji said when he was riding across the country, before he'd even met Master, when all he had was his experience of Autobiography of a Yogi, he had 2 parallel realities, Swamiji said, going along within him that whole 5 days and 5 nights of driving in the buses. He said the first was just his own extraordinary sense of elation and relief that he felt he had found a guru and had found a teaching and a truth which he'd been desperately searching for all of his years, which were not many, but they were still, it had been a very intense search. And the second, he said, which was equally strong, was this profound desire to tell everyone he knew about what he was learning. I mean, what he'd already learned, he wanted to share it with everyone. Swami himself later characterized his whole life. He said, in my life, I've only had, since he became a disciple, I've only had 2 desires. He said, to know God and to help others also to know Him. So, to know God is that desire for the inner joy. And that's what moves us all. But the hallmark of Swami's character was his enthusiasm, that he always wanted to take what he had inside himself and through his willpower express it out into the world. And that's what he devoted his life to doing. I'm working on writing a chronological account of Swami's life, the way he put the request to me when I spoke to him the last time I saw him before he left this world. He asked me to write the story of Ananda, which was sort of an odd request in a certain sense, because in a certain way I don't know much about the story of Ananda, even though for the first 16 years of my life I lived at Ananda village, and I was certainly there at the beginning, and for 30 years I've lived in Ananda Palo Alto, so I've always been part of Ananda. But what I know about Ananda is having watched Swami Kriyananda. And I sort of like, I've watched him, and everything else that's happened has been just a little bit in the background if it wasn't his own direct actions. So what Swami's request to me has caused me to do is to write a chronological account of my lifetime with Swami and what I observed. And I took many notes during the decades I was with him and have file cabinets full. I need a kinesthetic experience. Is that what you say? Is that the right word? I have to hold it in my hand. I can't put it just on the computer. So I have all this paper. I like the paper. But that's beside the point. But I had organized it all a number of years ago. But what I'm doing now, year by year, I'm reconstructing, which I had already done before, but now I'm reviewing. By no means did I keep track of everything, but I kept track of a lot, of just every act, even all the things he was doing day after day after day after day. And he never, just 1 year of his life, the accomplishment of 1 year of his life is what most people are lucky to do almost in a whole incarnation, or certainly in a decade, because he had this overwhelming inner joy, this extraordinary willpower to bring that out with enthusiasm. So what he was really saying to us, which in fact he was saying just weeks before he died, was, I'm done with that. Vairagya, I'm finished with the external world. And of course he was signaling a big change. Even if he hadn't died immediately, he was still signaling a big change in his own consciousness. Now, that was why I became so interested in all these pieces that I wanted to say. But now coming back to where we are with our own lives and not only his, I remember a time when a woman was trying to find what God wanted her to do in her life. She was part of Ananda. She was a disciple. She wanted to help Ananda grow. But she kept feeling confused about what her particular dharma within the whole of Master's work was. And the way she kept measuring it was how much she felt drawn to do something. And she was waiting for something to draw her. And I remember very specifically and definitely the way Swami answered her was he said, you're sitting waiting for something to make you feel enthusiastic. Enthusiasm is what you give to the world around you. It's not what the world around you gives to you. And I didn't have at that time this particular phrase, enthusiasm is the spirit of joy channeled through the power of the will. But that's what Swamiji was saying. You can't expect to have enthusiasm to just sit there and have it given to you. And there's also a level of serving God, which it's an interesting fact. I've thought about this many times. You can reach a certain level of refinement of your own nature, where you have a positive inclination to be helpful to other people. You've managed to progress beyond a certain self-centeredness that it gives you pleasure to help, pleasure to be serviceable, whatever it might be, to be kind. And then, let us say, you get on the spiritual path, and you can continue to sort of appear to be following spiritual principles just by following the already achieved level of egoic refinement, if that makes sense. So that you appear to be very nice and generous and unselfish in certain ways. But it's like, I'll serve God as long as it pleases me to serve him. And I'll serve him in the ways that I already enjoy doing. And then there's another level of service to God, which is where it pleases me to do whatever needs to be done. I remember somebody asked Swamiji once, how can you tell what your dharma is in a certain situation? What is your duty? He said, well, if there's a job to be done and you're the next one in line, which is very simple. People want to make this very complicated. What was I born to do? What is my passion? Follow your bliss, all of these different things. But sometimes those are just a masquerade for just follow your likes and dislikes. Just, do whatever you already like. Let your ego be the deciding factor. Now, all of these things are nuanced. I know that. And when I'm speaking in this way, I'm not covering every single base. But the answer here is that enthusiasm is a conscious act of willpower. And I know when Dale Carnegie, because I've read his books and enjoyed them very much, I've read them more than once, some of them, and he gave these examples. There was a baseball player, and his name became Pep Bedgar, I think was his name, Betger. And he wanted to be a major league ball player, and he got to a certain point, and they were about to cut him from the team. He was just about to lose his position because he just didn't have any get up and go. And he just made a decision. These are the stories that Dale Carnegie would tell. He just made a decision that he would be the most enthusiastic player out there. And he just started hustling and tossing the ball around and talking everything up. And after a while, his nickname became Pep, because he had so much dynamism, and he got better and better at the game, and gradually found himself with a solid position and a good job, and did very well, had a great deal of success. But he himself credited it to the decision that he made, which was to use his willpower to bring out a joyous attitude. Now, what Swami writes also about enthusiasm, he said, if we want to know joy, we must live always in the full expectation of it. To achieve happiness, one must work with happiness. So there's also another factor here which gets even more subtle than just affirming the right attitude. We start out just trying to behave well. But what happens is when you begin to put your willpower into something and to really try to see it, act as if you really loved it, often what happens is you start generating energy within yourself. It's most amazing to me, and I've seen it at work so many different times. As Master put it very simply, the instrument is blessed by that which flows through it. But let's put it another way. We are just a vibration of energy. And even the very thoughts that we think, as Master described it, is thoughts are universal, not individual, which is we reflect states of consciousness, we don't create them. And nor are we're not locked into any state of consciousness. The state of consciousness that we experience at any moment is an arbitrary decision. It doesn't feel arbitrary because the vrittis in our spine pull us in certain directions. But just from a strictly metaphysical point of view, all states of consciousness, all universal thoughts are available to us at any point. It's entirely a question of what we decide to be an instrument for. And so when we habitually decide to be negative in our attitudes, to lack enthusiasm, to be sad about what we do, and the more we keep receiving and transmitting that vibration, that becomes who we are. And the more you repeat a habit, the more the vrittis begin to develop in the spine, and the more that particular channel, it's like in your car radio when you have certain channels set. You just push a button or two and the signal goes right there. You take away a lot of your choices by presetting it. That's what we do inside ourselves when we repeat a certain vibration of consciousness over and over again. We become preset in that way. So that's the bad news. If the habit is depressed or self-doubt or lackadaisical, or lack of enthusiasm, it builds on itself. And it's the good news when you realize, if I act enthusiastic, I will become enthusiastic. And it's not really that you're just play acting. It's that when you begin to act enthusiastic and see things around you as worth giving your energy to, and as you begin to creatively think, how can I participate in this? What actually happens is you change the receiving station. And so after a while, it's not merely that you're affirming enthusiasm, you're actually experiencing it because you have used your willpower to channel your own inner joy, because the inner joy is always there. But if we wait, as that woman wrote to Swamiji and said, I'm waiting for something to call to me. He said, nothing will call to you until, he was very blunt, nothing will call to you, he said, until you first give it something, give it energy. This is the interesting thing about the spiritual path, and it's a very subtle aspect of it that is sometimes missed by, I don't know what you call them these days, New Age, New Thought. I would say that is sometimes missed by teachings that don't clearly enough understand the presence of God and the difference between egoic satisfaction and genuine progress towards self-realization. And the point I'm going to make is the role that willpower has to play in that process. Because you see, we're on a trajectory, and it is true that the end of that experience is perfect bliss. Those of us who saw Swamiji at the end of his life, you can see it. You can see him on many recordings and so on. There's a whole wonderful series called Ask Me About Truth, which is Swami Kriyananda talking with Dharmadas and Nirmala, two of his very close friends. They did 108 or something of those programs, maybe more than that. Just 15 minutes where they just would sit and talk, and Nirmala and Dharmadas pretended more ignorance of these teachings than they actually have in order to ask Swami certain questions. But it's very informal and very delightful. And that, among others that you can see, you just see how extraordinarily free his consciousness is. But now that I'm also reliving all those enormous years of effort, you realize that there is this constant necessity to put out willpower. So what I was starting to say here is that it's a paradox that you have to gradually understand from an intuitive level. And some positive thinking, affirmative, you can be whatever you want to be kind of teachings don't take into account the quality of willpower that's required. Oddly enough, it just to digress a little bit, but I feel like these points are interesting and important. One of the things that a certain amount of positive thinking, there's two things that these modern semi-truths have lost, although there's much good in them as they break away from dogmatism and suffering as the way as being pleasing to God inherently, and poverty and so on like that, consciousness of lack. But there's an inclination to not remember the presence of God. Wanting to reject a kind of dogmatic God, they forget the reality that the fact that we are part of a higher reality, that there is a greater reality than is obvious to us, and that our limited reality is inextricably linked to that greater reality, and we must find a proper relationship to that greater reality. Satchidananda is the beautiful Sanskrit word for it, ever existing, ever conscious, ever new bliss. Simple English word for it is God, but however you call it, you have to see that there's this greater reality, which means that what I myself am seeing, preferring, wanting, considering positive, negative, choosing, rejecting, is not necessarily what is really finally in my best interests. And of course we can talk about the will of God versus self-will, but we have to have that bigger picture. Otherwise the ego just randomly makes choices and has no idea. It's like letting a 5-year-old child direct his own life. The 5-year-old child just does not have a perspective. He just doesn't know what's coming. And the same way that the average adult doesn't know what's coming. We need a teacher, we need a guru, we need a teaching, we need a relationship to God, some consciousness that knows what's coming and where true happiness comes from. And the other thing that's too often left out, which sort of is a corollary to it, if there's no God, there's no Satan. Now, the devil's really not a very popular concept these days. But the devil's a very important concept. I don't mean the trident and the horns and all of that, but the downward pulling force to actually realize in our experience of life, which is if you pay attention, you will experience it, that the vibration is not neutral. It's not like you're just sitting at a point of perfect equilibrium and can either move in an expansive or a contractive direction. It's not like that. It's a neutral choice. There's a force. And there is a force pulling us toward expansiveness, but also there's a very powerful force pulling us toward the comfort of what we already are. And then there's another force that says you can be infinite in your potential. And what Satan represents, whether you want to talk about Satan or not, the Indian concept of Maya is much more subtle. And just like Satchidananda is a better word than God in English, also the word Maya is much more subtle than Satan. Because Maya is, it's seen as Maya is feminine, not because woman is the enemy, but it's feminine because it plays upon our emotions and our feelings, and it confuses the masculine side, which is reason. And so Maya confuses your reasoning, which is what feeling can, when they work together, they work beautifully. But Maya can also confuse your reasoning. And Maya is seen as this magician, this temptress, this force that just causes us to lose track of where we were really trying to go. And this whole world around us, which now the scientists are explaining to us why it is not what it seems. The ancient Indian tradition has been telling us for thousands of years beyond count that it's not what it seems. And these impulses that we have are not really going to bring us to happiness as we think they're going to. So if you have God and Satan, or Satchidananda and Maya, whatever however you want to call it, or if you want to put it in just words that don't have any theological emphasis, you have the superconscious, which is the part of our own reality that links us to infinity, and we have the subconscious, which in this meaning is the part of ourselves that links us to limited self-definition and ties us to what we already are and holds us in that limitation instead of allowing us to expand. However you want to describe it, the experience is we stand in the middle and these two forces pull on us. Swami writes in his autobiography, The Path, about a time when he was living at the desert retreat of the monks, when Master was at his retreat in 29 Palms, and Swami was doing some work with Master on editing the Bhagavad Gita commentary. And Master had also given him some work to do on his own to help with editing the Bible commentary and the commentary on the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. And the end result of it was Swami went through a very, very difficult period of spiritual testing for several months. And he described himself, he said he felt that, that there was a battle between light and dark going on, and he was caught in the middle, and he was just being pummeled every day. He just was standing there just being pummeled, and he could feel the two forces just at war within him, the part of himself that was trying to expand and the part of himself that was trying to hold himself back. Now, the end of all of that, and the reason I'm speaking of that at great length and the importance of it is, we must participate with willpower. If we imagine, because our true nature is divine, that we can simply drift into that divinity, we're sadly mistaken. The way of the world will just take you on its own way. People just repeat incarnation after incarnation after incarnation. You're a youth, you marry, you have children, you take care of your family, then you have grandchildren, and then you die, and then you start all over again. And you may, and people do, gradually, these ways of learning are very profound. The entire definition of superconsciousness is self-expansion, and we expand by serving those who are close to us. Often we are compelled into that service through the obligations that we take on. So any way of living can be a path to self-realization, but any way of living is not necessarily a path to self-realization unless you yourself exercise the willpower to make it so. And so even the need for enthusiasm is based on the premise that we must use willpower, that we have to channel willpower. And enthusiasm is a very accessible way to do it, because we can just watch ourselves. Just watch yourself between when you're enthusiastic about something and you're not. Watch how much energy you put out. Watch how much creativity you put out. And with Swamiji, as he himself said, the hallmark of his nature was enthusiasm. I spent hundreds, thousands of hours in Swami's company over the course of more than 40 years. And he was always enthusiastic. He never did anything by halfway measures. Even when he wasn't enthusiastic, he was enthusiastic. Even when he was, struggling, he would still apply his willpower. I remember once he was scheduling a trip to Europe, and it was a very, very busy schedule. And when I was working as his secretary then, and when I would have to work with his schedules, it was always a balance for me, because there was a certain protective instinct I had toward him, and he appreciated my intention, but he often had to correct me because he did not have a protective attitude toward himself. And I remember we were making the plans, and he was landing in London, in the afternoon, and then going on to the continent the next day. And so it was a question of whether or not he was going to notify some friend in London that he was there, spend the evening with that person, or whether he was just going to go to the hotel and have a night off. And I was advocating a little bit for him to go to have a night off, and Swami he couldn't quite decide, and he was going to phone the man. The phone was right there. This was before email. He was going to telephone the man in London. And he kept sort of reaching for the phone and not reaching for the phone, reaching and not. And I finally looked at him and I said, "You're trying to decide whether it's better to see him now or whether it's to risk having to reincarnate because you didn't take care of it in the moment." And he laughed and said, "That's exactly true." And then he picked up the phone and called the man in London, which is, there's no escaping what we have to do. And so Swamiji was, if I owe this man a visit, if I choose myself instead of choosing the possible good that I can do for him, then I'm going to have to just come back to the point where I'm willing to expand, to include him, instead of only thinking about myself. And Swamiji always exercised his willpower. We were, as I say, we were joking about it, but no, when it really came down to it, he was going to do it because it needed to be done. And what was the point? And then he would do it enthusiastically. He wasn't going to sit there and be crabby and wished he'd done something else. Once he committed to doing it, that was just simply what he was going to do. Swami always kept his word, and he always kept his word without the slightest bit of resentment. He never allowed himself to feel imposed upon. If it was his to do, he would always do it with enthusiasm, because he would take the joy from inside himself and then use his willpower to make this into a joyful experience. You see, that's what we're talking about. When you're enthusiastic about something, that the very definition of that is that you're having fun doing it, isn't it? When Dale Carnegie talked about Pep Bedker, he was having fun. He was just going out there having fun. And what, of course, happened on a baseball team is when this one player is really just moving and laughing and cheering and making it happen, everybody else starts coming up to that, because enthusiasm is contagious. So not only did he become better at what he was doing because he was more concentrated on it, but everybody else around him also becomes better. So, but where does that energy come from? Where does that joy come from? And this is going back to that woman again. She thought it was inherent in the objects around her, or the job around her, or the freedom from responsibility, or whatever words are going through your head. You've decided that external conditions limit or give me my joy. And Swami says, if you want to have happiness, you have to do it with happiness. And that's what enthusiasm is. You do it with happiness. This is what we have to do. I remember once it was about 110 degrees at Ananda village, and a very hot summer day. And the temple and the dining room are right across this foyer. And at that time we had these vinyl chairs, and some of them were brown and some of them were yellow. And one very hot day, Haridas, who was on the retreat staff, there was maybe 100 chairs or 200 chairs in total of each kind. And he was moving all the brown chairs into the dining room and then all the yellow chairs into the temple. He was reversing the color combination. It was he was doing it on a Sunday afternoon, and a very hot day, all by himself. And I wasn't about to help him, but I was going to commiserate with him. Haridas, what are you doing? And he said, exercising. That's what he said. Because he was a little bit rotund. He kind of patted his rather ample belly, moderately ample. He said, I'm exercising, always good to do a little exercise. And then he sort of smiled and basically said that someone had decided that the brown chairs were better here and the yellow are better here. But then he said, but if they change their mind, I think I'll let them move it the next time. But still, even that, it was just, this is not an unpleasant experience. This is something that has to be done. And I'm just going to do it. There's a very interesting statement which I've remembered in the Ramayana, the story of Rama and Sita being exiled to the forest. And Rama's father inadvertently, one of his queens is owed a boon, and she calls in that favor, and that favor is that his favorite son, Rama, has to be exiled to the forest instead of crowned as the king. And it's a great blow to the king, so much so, in fact, that he dies from the grief of it. But he's pleading with Rama to stay just one more day. And Rama answers him. He says, inevitable disappointment will not be lessened by delay. Which is, I've always remembered that, inevitable disappointment. Now, I'm not just thinking disappointment, but the task will not be lessened merely by not doing it. It just simply has to be done. And if it has to be done, well, let's be enthusiastic about it. Now, that's another way of saying, what God sends me, I accept with gratitude. One of my very earliest memories, I have a few very, very young memories, and this was myself, 2 years old, maybe 3, I really don't know, but I was quite small. I'm not really sure I had much language at the time even. And I had this toy shelf, which in memory, it was as big as as the wall, but I don't think so. I think it was probably just a very small shelf of toys. And for some reason, I decided that I wanted to clean out my toy shelf. And so I took everything that was on a couple of these shelves and I just pulled it all into a big pile in the center of the room. And being even then rather of a Gemini nature, I lost interest in it once they were all piled on the floor, and I went off to do something else. My mother discovered that I had created quite a disorderly mess in my room and had abandoned it with seemingly no sense of responsibility, and she really wasn't going to allow this. So she brought me back into the room and told me that I needed to put all those toys back on the shelf. She wasn't about to do it for me. I had to do it for myself. And I remember this incredible sense of despair over this overwhelming task that I had to do as a child. And you know how children do that fake cry when they want someone to rescue them from something they don't really need rescuing from. And I remember picking up each of the toys like this and just sort of whimpering as I did it, and feeling that lifting each little toy was just so difficult. And sometimes I'd sort of stop and feel the sense of despair before I'd put it on the shelf. That, I remember that. And I also remember simultaneously this thought in my mind, this very adult voice within me that said, oh, this is really nothing. Just put the darn toys back on the shelf. Just like, what is this about? In other words, use your willpower to channel your inner energy. And your inner energy is just fine. There's nothing wrong here. This is all you just making it wrong. But you can, and you must, take your inner joy and use it. Use it now in this way. And act enthusiastic, and you will be enthusiastic, because you will then tap into the continuous wellspring of divine energy that's in you if you choose to use it with your willpower. Passively wait, and you'll wait forever. This is the power of the 8 manifestations of God, which are such a magnificent tool to have in your toolbox. The 8 manifestations of God, classically, love, peace, joy, calmness, light, sound, wisdom, power. And this is a long conversation. I'm sure somewhere on the YouTube channel or on the Ananda Palo Alto channel of audio and video talks, you'll find classes I've given on the subject. If you're not familiar with it, I really urge you to go look there. There's not, Swamiji has written about it, but it can be, and you can find those also, but it can be greatly expanded, which is what the classes provide. But here's the reality of it. We often think that I want to be an instrument of the divine. I want to be a channel for God's presence. But God is a very abstract word. Even Satchidananda, there's still an abstraction to it. And here you are taking care of a crying baby, or trying to sit in an office doing a job that is not so interesting, or dealing with a grumpy client. And it's sort of hard to think, how do I be an instrument of God in this particular situation? So when you think of God not as an abstraction beyond creation, but that God manifests in the world through these 8 different qualities, then whenever you're in a situation and you don't quite know what to do, or your own access is limited by your vrittis in your chakras, or whatever it is that's affecting you, you can consider those 8 different aspects and try to understand what is accessible to you in the moment, well, you might ask what's appropriate for this situation, what's ideal for this situation, and then you might ask, what do I have access to? And I have found that I always have access to one or the other of them. I don't always have access to all of them. I don't always have access to the optimum choice, the ideal choice. Sometimes a situation calls for a very loving response, and I'm just not up to it. But perhaps I can manifest calmness. Or it calls for a peaceful response, and I'm not able to be entirely peaceful, but at least I can think in terms of what the principle is here. I can manifest a little wisdom. Or I can try to be a brighter light. If people are feeling a little down and I don't quite know what to do, I can just be a lighter force. I don't have to get into the grumpiness of everyone around me. And power, which I often think of as energy, energy is always often the one option, at least in my own life, that I at least have access to. And that can manifest like, let's say that I'm emotionally distressed about something. Somebody has spoken to me in an unkind way, or inadvertently done something that is distressing to me, or even deliberately, but usually inadvertently in the life I live. People don't mean to cause grief, but sometimes they do. And perhaps it's knocked me off my pins a bit, and the vrittis get you. But energy is so therefore joy is not an option, maybe love is not an option, maybe calmness or peace are not options. Wisdom is not an option, because I'm just not capable at that moment. But energy is always there. And if I can't use my energy to meditate, for example, and change my consciousness, I can just come downstairs from where my office is and I can do the dishes. I can go grocery shopping. I can cut the weeds in the backyard. I can just put out energy in some way that changes the channel. And just pure energy is one of the ways divine manifests. Enthusiasm is a way to put out energy. Because if we're not enthusiastic, what's the characteristic of not being enthusiastic? There I was as a child. I just don't want to put these toys back on the shelf, and it just seems like so much work to do it. And I can still remember, I can sort of remember some little stuffy of some sort, and I can remember lifting it to there and then dropping it dramatically onto my knee. I'm going to digress here with this marvelous thing I heard Meryl Streep say. Meryl Streep, of course, is one of the most remarkable actresses of our time, and she was receiving some award for her extraordinary lifetime achievement of acting success. And as she stood up there, she was thanking all the people that, deserve credit for the successful career she's had. And she said, I particularly want to thank my mother and father. My mother and father were two of the most brilliant, artistic, creative, intelligent, interesting people that I've ever met, she said. And from the day I was born until they both died, they fought every single day. And I want to thank them for introducing me at a young age to drama, she said. And she gave them credit for her great career as a dramatic actress. Well, my parents did not fight. I was not introduced to drama, just the opposite. I had a very peaceful household, but I was born with it. And there it is, just this dramatic energy. It's total lack of enthusiasm. And a little piece of me saying, just be enthusiastic about this. Oh, look, we get to put this all back. I remember when I was living at Ayodhya in the 70s, and Ayodhya was one of the neighborhoods within Ananda village. And there was a spring that we drew most of our water from at that time. Subsequently, I think they put Ayodhya on some well or something. And we were all always trying to figure everything out. We didn't really have the money to hire real experts, and everybody would just try to sort out how things should be done most of the time. Some people had real training and real skills, but a lot of times we were guessing. And the spring was a naturally flowing spring, and we had some kind of an enclosure for it. And at one point, it was thought that the spring would flow better if we filled the enclosure with fine gravel, and then that would filter the water before it came into the storage tank. But then when the spring was not flowing so well, they thought it would be good if we took all that gravel out. I'm not sure whether we put it in and took it out more than one cycle each, but I have in my memory, I feel like we did it more than one each. But I can remember, and it was the women who did it at least once, just, putting all that gravel in and then pulling all that gravel out. And I'm talking like a 6-foot square. It was a lot of gravel, and it was heavy, and it was a hole. So I remember being sort of down in it, trying to pull the gravel out, and it being a normal 110-degree day in the summer. But it was just so loony that there was no point in not enjoying yourself. Just bring your inner joy to bear on the event. If you act enthusiastic, you become enthusiastic, because then you're beginning to channel one of the 8 manifestations of God, which is who we really are, you see. We are, those 8 manifestations is our true nature. Depression, sadness, low energy, self-limiting ideas. That's not our true nature. And it can hold us for about as long as we let it hold us, which, because of the vrittis, it's complicated. But if we start exercising our willpower just to push against it and just try to behave but not in a way that is hypocritical or resentful. I read somewhere, someone sent me a definition of suppression, which I think was actually Swami's words. To suppress something is to push it away with the desire that you're not going to have it when you have no actual realization that there's a preferable alternative. So you're merely denying yourself rather than holding one reality at bay for the sake of embracing a higher reality. I mean, that's transmutation. Even if it's still a struggle, you may still be struggling, but a piece of you knows that the reason I'm doing this is because there's a higher reality that I prefer. Suppression is merely when you don't really believe in the higher reality, you're just denying yourself whatever it is that you think you should have. So when you accept that, well, this is what God has given me to do, or this is what has been given me to do. You don't even have to elevate it to God's will. This is what I have to do to earn money or to whatever it might be. This is what I have to do. And so if I'm accepting that doing my duty, as it has been offered to me, or accepting reality, Swamiji always says that before you can really transmute reality, you have to actually accept that it's there. It doesn't mean that you have to accept that it's unchangeable, but you at least have to relate to it. It's there. If your leg has been amputated, if you've had a stroke and half of your body doesn't work, you can't just sit there and pretend that it does. You have to actually engage in whatever it is that's required of you to make it happen. You have to do the therapy. You have to do the exercises that will compensate for what's happened. You can't just sit there and pretend it hasn't happened. And if we find ourselves, as we often do, I have very little tolerance for the mundane chores of life. I try to be as efficient as possible. And I was changing clothes at the YMCA, and there was a little crowd by the lockers. I said, just don't worry, I'll be out of here in 30 seconds. And I was. Just bingo, in and out. And the lady made a comment, you're fast. And I said, I don't have any patience for these mundane tasks. I just like to do them efficiently and quickly and just get them out of my life, just be done with it. I mean, I think there's another smell the roses as you go along the way attitude, so I'm not saying my way is the best by any means. But many things are given to us and we just have to do them. And they can be completely consuming. I mean, a gentleman was speaking to me about, he's in the middle of his life and he has a family, he has a mortgage, and he said he recognizes that he's not going to get any satisfaction out of his career. He can see it already. It's just not turning out to be what he thought it was. But he has to do it because he has a duty to the other obligations he's taken on. But that resistance is not our true nature. Our true nature is God is always equally present in everything. So if we start finding a way to at least bring some of that inner reality, and this is where enthusiasm comes. That's why it's such a very, very interesting quality. And that's why it was so interesting and notable in that last letter of Swamiji that it's the thing he referred to. He was saying, my enthusiasm, which was just spontaneous and effervescent everywhere, because, why was that? Because he had so much inner joy, and he had so much compassion and love for people, that it was effortless for him to use his willpower to constantly be sharing it. As fast as he could understand anything about the spiritual path, he wanted to pass it on over here. He actually said that masters often reiterated statement to him that you have a great work to do. And Rajasi's repeating of it, you have a great work to do, and Master will give you the strength to do it. Swami said in another context that Master often praised Swamiji for his creativity and the way he served, that it wasn't merely that he was dutiful, he actually applied all his talents to it and found creative new ways to do things, because Swamiji so profoundly and deeply wanted people to experience the joy that he was experiencing. So that enthusiasm was always there, translated into outer action. And so that's what it is, that where the affirmation that we need to make our enthusiasm. He says enthusiasm itself is an affirmation. It's an affirmation of our own capacity to feel joy in all circumstances. It's a declaration of freedom from allowing outward conditions to determine our state of mind. The actual expression of enthusiasm by an act of will is a declaration of freedom from giving outward circumstances control over our state of mind. And if we have effortless enthusiasm, if you have effortless enthusiasm for something, I mean, just think about it. I mean, think how desirable that is. Whenever we're enthusiastic about something, nobody has to push us. And we don't have any sense of the need for willpower, we just are. And that's what that woman was writing to Swamiji. I don't want to have to work at loving things, I want to love them automatically, is essentially what she was saying. And he said back to her, it's a false teaching, it's not going to work. You know, you have to give first, you can't just sit there waiting for life to give to you. And so this is key number 18 of 26. How do you live with higher awareness? It's realizing that enthusiasm is an act of will. And what you're affirming is that I can have joy in all circumstances. Doesn't make any difference what circumstances I'm in, I will be enthusiastic. Many years ago, Swamiji, it was actually 1976, 1975-76, he started we were in a situation at Ananda Village where the planning department had a director who was not competent. And we were trying to get a plan through the county as a planned unit development, which has become quite common now, but was not at all common then, where you have mixed usages, mixed zoning usages on the same piece of land. And the planning director was not competent, and she did not know how to deal with us, because it was new, and we were different. And her, as a bureaucrat, she was covering, as Swami said, covering her incompetence by just saying no. It's always easier to say no. As Swami put it, we were the problem, and if she just said no to us enough, she thought we'd go away. It wasn't our planned unit development, it was we ourselves. He saw that we needed to get her taken out of office, so he started this little campaign in order to get her taken out of office. It was 1976, so he called it the Bicentennial Liberty Committee. And nobody wanted to do it with him. But he got me into it. He got me enthusiastic by presenting it to me as it would be a lot of fun. And he was right. I got enthusiastic. And when I get enthusiastic, I can get other people to be enthusiastic. So I got us all quite enthusiastic about I got a lot of people enthusiastic, by no means all, but enough, to just do something that was completely wacky just for the sake of doing it, or seemed wacky, because we were very unpolitical at that time. But it all began with enthusiasm. Because once you're enthusiastic, it's effortless after that. So work with this. It's 18, only one of 26. But act enthusiastic and you'll become enthusiastic. Use your willpower to manifest your inner joy, and everything in your life will become much easier. God bless you.